Hi there, it's Marla at Narrate. As Adam continues with the Slowed Down Spirituality series, he discusses the connection that exercise, nutrition, and sleep have on our spiritual health. What if slowing down causes us to take better care of our bodies, and taking better care of our bodies leads to greater spiritual wholeness? Enjoy the message.
So we're in this conversation called Slowed Down Spirituality, and part of what hit me this week was that I'm getting old. And what hit me about that was, I don't know why I hadn't thought of it in these terms, but for the entirety of my adult life, I've been pretty deeply and genuinely impacted by Western evangelical tradition. I wasn't raised in it, but at 17 years old, I stumbled into the back door of what proved to be a really great church in Billings called Faith Chapel. And I sat in the back row and hid in that church for a number of years. That's why we value your anonymity, those of you that like to hide and be the last one in and the first one out. That was very formative for me. And at 19 years old, just a few months after graduating high school, I had this pretty intentional moment where it was this sense of like, okay, Lord, for 2 years I've heard people tell me that I could give my life to you, and I feel like I've done nothing but mess it up, so if you want it, here you go. And at that point, I pretty genuinely just threw myself into what I would now call the Western evangelical traditions, things like prayer and Bible study and going to church and volunteering and these very important things. In fact, early in my journey, a friend pointed me to a book written by a guy named Richard Foster, this great Quaker thinker, called In Celebration of Discipline. And in that book, he outlines these 12 spiritual disciplines that he calls kind of the great disciplines of the church. Well, only 20 years later can I appreciate they are the great disciplines of the church, but if we're being honest, they're the great disciplines of the Western church. And I'm very, very grateful for the way those things have impacted me. But part of what I've started to see, and I don't know how deep into this we'll get this summer, but part of what I'm experiencing is that there are these great traditions from, say, the Eastern Orthodox Church and from some non-Western evangelical traditions that are equally as formative and helpful, and yet they're just off of our radar screen. And that's not a critical thing. That's just we all have a capacity thing and we can't think about everything all at the same time kind of thing. But I say all that to say, because I think this morning's category of slowing down fits into all of that, in that I don't think it's a way that we would generally think about spiritual discipline. This morning, I guess ultimately the question that I want to ask is, what if slowed down spirituality is embodied spirituality? And what I'm really trying to get at there is what if God and the Bible and the text and the church tradition is well aware of the fact that what we do with and to our bodies, it's not just a moralistic thing. Oftentimes we hear take care of your body because it's the temple. No, that may be part of the conversation, but what if on a bigger level, how we interact with things like nutrition and exercise and sleep are actually connected to how we connect with God? I had my own aha here several months ago when I became disillusioned with myself, and sometimes, in fact, I've caught myself saying intuitively when people will approach me and say, hey, this morning was helpful, good job, whatever. Without trying to be snarky, I've caught myself saying, well, if only I could do it. And I think I'm getting to that middle age of life where I'm profoundly frustrated that I know the right ideas to talk about, and I know the right things to do, and I'm increasingly disillusioned with the fact that I still can't do it. And for a while, I've thought of friends of mine and even close family members who, frankly, aren't a part of this place or anything like it. And oftentimes, I think for the majority of my adult life, I've looked at them and assumed that they're not a part of it, they're not a part of this, because they don't like me or they don't like us or they don't believe in Jesus. And don't get me wrong, I think that still can be true at times, but part of what I've realized is I've experienced my own disgust with my own inability to live out the stuff that I claim to believe and to act on the things that I know to be true. Is this realization of, I wonder if some of these people in my life, I wonder if they're not here, not because they don't believe, but because they can't take the disappointment anymore. Not disappointment with me or you or us, but the realization that part of what happens when you open the scriptures, part of what happens when you're part of a community like this, is you're constantly coming up against these ideals, and it's not that they don't believe them, it's that they're frustrated that they can't do them. You know what I mean? In fact, maybe you're there, and chances are you work with them. I would put all of that into this category because here's really my thesis, and I feel like this morning is one of those ones where I'm not as concise as I know I ought to be. But what if sometimes, when trying to grow in the way we love our spouse or our kids or in our work or our classmates, trying to grow in our love of God and experience of God, what if sometimes it's not doubling down on the things we already know to do, like reading the Bible and praying and going to church? And what if God allows that sometimes the most spiritually healthy thing is to go for a walk, to get consistent exercise, to pay attention to your sleep patterns, to understand how nutrition impacts your capacity to love God? What if sometimes the answer isn't you need to do more of that kind of esoteric stuff? And I'm not questioning the value of that stuff, not for a second. But what if God sometimes goes, yeah, I actually really want you to become that person too. But you don't understand how your experience of sleep actually physically makes that really difficult to pull off. You don't understand how your experience of nutrition actually makes that almost impossible. Like it would be a 5,000 fish kind of miracle if you could sleep that way or eat that way or exercise that way and love Jesus the way you desire to love him. You know, for me, I was thinking about this week, and I think really, let's go to that next slide. Really the way I'm trying to frame this is this. What if slowing down causes us to take better care of our bodies, and taking better care of our bodies causes us to experience greater wholeness? Like last week we talked about, without the Sabbath, figuratively and literally, the opportunities to love God and love people goes away. That seems to be what the scriptures are saying. What if the same can be said for exercise, nutrition, and sleep? That without developing the discipline of slowing down, one's ability to be healthy physically, and listen, I am not the poster child of any of this. I'm not saying that we can't ever splurge on things. Ironically, I was just texting a friend who had invited us over to watch some football today, and they're like, what are you bringing? And I'm like, I'm bringing soda, beer, probably not supposed to admit that, but I'm just being honest, some high fructose corn syrup, pinwheels, potato chips, and dip. So I'm not claiming to never step into, please don't misunderstand me on all of this. I was having lunch with my friend Stan several years ago, and Stan is this great leader actually of that church that I referenced earlier where I had the opportunity to have my own views of Jesus reimagined. He comes here and teaches once a year now as he's retired, and he knows a lot about me and my idiosyncrasies in this culture, and he knows that I love to run, and he knows that I struggle with anxiety, and he knows that I'm a control freak and mostly not a nice person. And as we were talking, he said, Adam, do you also struggle with depression? And I said, and it was one of those like, okay, wise sage asking me a question. I don't want to be the know-it-all. He's like, no. I was like, actually, I don't think I do. He said, interesting, because typically, someone who struggles with anxiety also struggles with depression. Now, let me put a big asterisk by that, because what I know of Stan is he's not a psychiatrist, he's not a psychologist, neither am I. This isn't our field of study. We fall into that category of enough information to be dangerous, but not always accurate. But what I also know about Stan is he's the type of leader who he's way more competitive, goes way faster than I am. He led this church of like 6,000 people. I mean, he's this phenomenal leader who on more than one occasion has hit this point of burnout. And in one case, I think there's more than one, but I know for sure of one case. It was so profound that he was literally kind of whisked away to a treatment facility out of state where people had to get really invasive and look at his patterns and look at the way he lives and begin to understand, why are you hitting these points of emotional and physical breakdown? So he's been on the receiving end of great professional coaching and psychiatric care. And so when he said generally one goes with the other, he's not a psychiatrist, but he has a lot of experience in this. And then he said, I think I know why. And listen, I'm not trying to trivialize anyone's struggle with depression or claim that there's simple answers to it all the time. But he said, I think I know why. And he said, it's because you run. It's your commitment to exercise. Again, I'm not trying to oversimplify those things. And here's my point. I am encouraged to be influenced by a man who has given his life to the church, who didn't take me to a verse. And listen, I love the Bible. But isn't it encouraging that he would go, wait a minute, there are physiological explanations for some of our experiences of God. There's another way to ask this. What if Plato's wrong? Now, I'm just warning you, Plato's going to come up a bit in the next several weeks because I think there's some profound observations we need to make. Plato, this Roman philosopher, I'm going to be rudimentary here and basic, but at his core, Plato taught, he was an ascetic. I kept saying an aesthetic in the first service, and it turns out there's two different spellings and two different pronunciations. He was an ascetic. Blah, blah, blah. And at his core, he believed that the physical is a distraction and bad, and that spiritual enlightenment is about removing ourselves from the physical and disappearing into the spiritual. At his core, his belief was the goal of it all is to escape this and arrive up there with the chubby angels and the harps and the floating around in the sky. Question, what if he's wrong? Richard Rohr, this great Catholic Franciscan thinker, he says that the very last words said to him in seminary were this. Go ahead to that next slide. Gentlemen, these are the parting words in his graduate education. You must always remember that Christianity has been far more influenced by Plato than by Jesus Christ. Now, what is he saying? Because some of you are going, I think you've described my understanding of heaven. That's just it. But can you see how if in fact this doesn't matter, arriving up there matters, that impacts the way we think about our bodies? The way it impacts the way we think about sleep and nutrition. And my question is that the way the narrative of the text, the wisdom, the history of the text, is that the way it speaks of it? Think about a guy named Elijah. Elijah was this Hall of Fame Old Testament character. If you were going to make a Mount Rushmore of Old Testament characters, Elijah gets to make the list. I think he's probably in the final cut. If for no other reason, then he's often compared to Jesus, or Jesus compared to him. Elijah has had all these accomplishments, all these brave moments, all these awesome experiences, and one day he catches word that there's a particular powerful woman that wants him dead, and he snaps. He goes running. In fact, like Forrest Gump, he doesn't stop for days, it would seem, because what we know is that he ran from Jezreel to Beersheba. Now, that may not mean anything to us, but in the world of Israel, what that's telling us is he just ran from the northernmost border of Israel to the southernmost border. Beersheba, it is to Israel, it's the last outpost before the wilderness. It's Glendive on your way to Bismarck. Like after that, it's just watch your dog run away for days because it's nothing, right? Or maybe it's Billings. I would argue it's Billings, but whatever. Beersheba is on the edge of the wilderness. After that, it's barren nothingness forever. So he freaks out, he snaps, he's scared, he runs, he acts out of character. He arrives in Beersheba, and then he gets to Beersheba, and he's like, I still think I haven't gone far enough. And so he leaves everybody who's with him in his kind of flight, and he goes a day's journey into the wilderness, which means he goes a day's journey like past Glendive, and if it's August, you're dead, right? I mean, there's no surviving. In fact, the text says this in chapter 19. He came to a broom bush, we'll talk about that in a second, sat down under it and prayed that he might die. Now here's a picture of a broom bush. Again, broom bush to the context of the Bible is like sagebrush. Like if someone said, I got there and there was nothing but sagebrush, you go, okay, I'm in eastern Montana, and if it's August, the ground has cracks in it that are 12 feet wide, and it hasn't rained for years, and it's hot. That's where he's at. Completely discouraged. Now watch this. I've had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. So his thumb is firmly in his mouth. Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. He's toast. He's snapped. He's in his inferior self. He doesn't even know what he believes anymore. He's completely acting out of character. And God shows up, and watch what God does. All at once, an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. Not, Elijah, you need to recite the Apostles' Creed. Elijah, do you remember your first communion? Do you remember what you believed when you did that? Get up and eat. Ever been hangry? Or been married to hangry? There's few things worse in life than dealing with hangry, right? Because it's irrational, it's illogical. There's ever had a hangry sixth grader or middle school kid in your life? It's one of the world's worst things. And God seems to understand it. He keeps going. He looked around, he being Elijah, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank, and then he lay down again. Ever had to say to your kids, you know what you need? My dad used to always say, you're so tired you can't stand the sight of yourself. I think about how moody I was in high school, and you often wonder, like, what went wrong there? And then I realized that, did you ever drink water in high school? Like, I'm not sure I ever had a glass of water in high school. And then I got married, and my wife is a nurse, and she taught me, like, one of the first symptoms of dehydration is irritability. And I was like, I think I know my problem. It hasn't helped me all that well. But my poor kids, they'll have to get therapy over how much water we've made them drink. Because any kind of emotional anything, and my wife is like, go get a glass of water and sit down. And then there's like, but isn't it somewhat refreshing that God would, like, I think it's worth noting what God doesn't say to him here. Kate was the first one to make this observation for me, but she just pointed out that God tended to his physical needs, not separate from his spiritual needs, in order to attend to his quote-unquote spiritual needs. And the story keeps going. Then the angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. So he got up and ate and drank, strengthened by that food. He traveled 40 days and 40 nights. So he's still running. He's still freaking out until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night. And only then did God start to get him back on track. Or we could ask it this way if we break it down a little bit. What if sleep is profoundly spiritual? Like what if our experience of sleep matters? There's a guy, Sean Stevenson, I learned about him this last summer. on a podcast, and he's written a book, but to be honest with you, I wouldn't read the book. He's one of those guys who, he gave it all away. His marketing director was PO'd because he gave all of the information away in this podcast interview that I referenced on that mind map, and Kate posted those to Facebook if you don't grab those here. Sean Stevenson has compiled all of this research on sleep. So he's one of those guys, he's nothing like me. He doesn't just get up here with a microphone and ideas. He actually has research behind the stuff he says and points to. And part of his interest was to point to information that speaks not to more sleep, not quantity, but quality. One of the first things he talks about is that sleep scientists now understand that we need 4 sleep cycles a night, and that none of our sleep cycles are the same length. They vary from 75 to 90 minutes, which would mean we need, he would say, somewhere between 6 and 8 hours of sleep. He also points out, did you know that the World Health Organization has now said that by 2030, not that far away, 50% of the people on the planet will either have survived cancer or have it in that moment. 50% of the people. He goes on to say and point to all this research that says that now they're starting to believe that one of the primary activators of one of the primary epigenetic activators. So we talk about genetics, and genetics, we've talked about that for decades, and it's very important that, we can be predisposed to certain things because of our genetics. But then we go okay, so 2 siblings, why does one have this and the other one doesn't when they have presumably the same genes or similar nonetheless? Epigenetics is now starting to understand that. Explain that. Epigenetics gets into what turns said genes on or off. So just because you have the gene for heart disease doesn't mean you're necessarily going to have heart disease. It's how do you turn that gene on? Now what research is starting to say is that perhaps the strongest epigenetic trigger is sleep or sleeplessness. That there's all this research behind heart disease, diabetes, cancer tied to sleep. Why? Because with that research is that perhaps, and again, I don't think it's conclusive, and I don't want to represent it as such, and you may want to go look at the research yourself, but there's considerable conversation around melatonin, that it may be the strongest natural defense we have from cancer, which would matter because guess what? When you sleep during the day, your body doesn't produce melatonin. In fact, the World Health Organization has now called night shift work a class 2 carcinogen. Why? Because when you sleep during the day, during daylight, your body doesn't produce melatonin. Same with when you go to bed, overloaded on caffeine, and people will go well, I can drink coffee till I go to bed. Getting sleep and having melatonin are 2 completely pieces of conversation. Same with alcohol. Too much alcohol, and your body doesn't produce melatonin. My point is simply this. What if God knows what he's talking about? And what if when guys like David say in the Psalms, because it seems like David is perpetually talking about sleep in the Psalms. Check out Psalm 3. I lie down and sleep. I wake again because the Lord sustains me. See, for David, sleep and God were not separate topics. Psalm 4, in peace I will lie down and sleep, for you alone, Lord, make me dwell in safety. My point is simply this, that before we get discouraged with our own ability to transform, what if we went wait a minute? Maybe God made me a physical creature who needs sleep, and maybe my next quote-unquote spiritual discipline is to get more serious about that. We could ask the question this way. In your mind, when does a day begin? Our friend from Groundhog's Day has one opinion. Go ahead, we've got a clip here.
Nuts.
The Bible seems to have a different idea about when the day begins. The Bible's idea seems to, if you look at Genesis, be completely different. In Genesis, there's this epic poem of creation, and the narrator seems to break in after each day, and the text says this, and there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And the Jews have been pointing out ever since that the day starts not at sunrise, but at dusk. Now, why does that matter? In the Jewish mind, day starts when the third star appears in the sky. Why does that matter? Well, what's fueling what? See, in their mind, the day doesn't start when you wake up. The day has already started. See, tonight, and this gets kind of weird. It's hard to wrap your brain around. And when you're reading the Bible and it refers to night, that's where especially the events around Jesus' death and resurrection get so confusing. It's like, what day is it? I'm confused. Because tonight, when the sun sets at like 2 p.m., whenever it sets around here these days, does anybody else start counting the days after December 21st? Like, yeah, buddy, all gets better from here. I feel like I've accomplished something when I make it to December 21st every year. In the Jewish mind, I completely forgot I was talking about there. Tonight is Monday night. Sunday night already happened, which begins to paint a picture. In fact, Eugene Peterson says it this way. He says, all of this conditions us to the rhythm of grace. We go to sleep and God begins his work. See, we think we get up in the morning and the world starts. But what the scriptures say is that in the evening, like the farmer's not doing anything, but the crops are growing. And in the evening, the clinic is closed, but wounds are healing. And in the evening, the leader, the businessman, the thinker, they're not actively doing anything, but what we all know from experience is some of our best leadership business moments happen first thing in the morning. Why? Because our brain has been doing stuff. And there's this almost mystical perspective that the Bible offers that says, wait a minute, when you wake up in the morning, you join with what God has already been doing, but what comes with that is this perspective of God doesn't need you. He loves to use you, but the world keeps happening without your activeness. What happens when we recognize that sleep is a vital part of the whole equation? Or how about this? What if exercise is spiritual? I might be stretching it a bit here, and certainly the Bible's primary aim isn't to point to any of this, but I do think we can observe it. I wonder, though, why did Moses get the 10 Commandments at the top of a mountain? Just seriously. I mean, I know that sounds facetious, but seriously. Like, why didn't he get them while sitting around the breakfast table eating Cheerios? Why did Moses experience the burning bush so far removed from home base? I mean, presumably he stepped over a bush just like it every morning. Presumably he might have stepped on one every morning. Why was it after such a long walk that he had such a deep spiritual moment with God? Or Elijah, we've already talked about, like he kind of went off his rocker and was just scared of everything and lost all sense of value. And you know when he finally got things back together? When he arrived at Horeb, the mountain of God, which, by the way, is Mount Sinai. Same place Moses got the 10 Commandments, which followed this long bit of exercise and nutrition. Is that all coincidence? My friend Dan, he's one of those unknown heroes in our community. I've been getting to know him. He's been a drug detective in Helena for almost 2 decades. He's the one that, through this really awesome kind of random encounter up in the balcony before an 8:30 one morning, and I asked his permission to share this story, by the way. He's the one that connected us to the drug court. We had coffee several months ago, and he's pretty new, as best I can tell, to the church and Jesus conversation and very engaged by it. And we're having coffee, and we're talking about these drug treatment court clients, and he said, and he, I mean, it's a conversation. He said, Adam, you know what I think all those clients, what they need to get well? He said, I think they would all benefit from church, which, I mean, that's flattering, and that's the Jesus that I experienced, but I don't want to cram that down anybody's throat. He said, I think they would all benefit from church and exercise. In fact, some drug treatment courts have built gyms to accompany the court because it's a part of the treatment program. My question is this: if people helping people who suffer from some of the very worst addictions understand the role of exercise, then is it possible that God connects it to your ability to connect to him as well? Like, what if exercise is profoundly spiritual? What if nutrition is spiritual? And again, there are people far more healthy than I'm not even organic, so I'm not trying to take shots at people that are. But I think we can. Please don't misunderstand me here. But what if sometimes God goes, yeah, I know you're trying, I know you're discouraged, but there's only so much I can do in spite of Hot Pockets. Like, let's just be honest. I'm not picking on Hot Pockets, those molten lava things that make your taste buds not work for months at a time. Have you ever heard Jim Gaffigan's thing on Hot Pockets? You should all Google that. It's hilarious. There's a moment in 1 Timothy where Paul says something to Timothy, and if you're not familiar with the way the Bible is laid out, Paul is to the New Testament what Obi-Wan is to Star Wars. So he's writing this letter to these young Jedis, if you will, these Paul is this great follower of Jesus who wrote over half the New Testament, who's writing to this young follower of Jesus who's trying to help both himself and others. And the pattern that Paul often writes with is he'll write these kind of theological things, very important things, and at the end he'll just kind of, it's like, here's the note in the lunchbox. Don't forget to do these 3 things. Or, mom's not home in the morning. Here's the list of things to do. Paul often does that to him. And at the end of 1 Timothy, one of those little bulleted things is this: stop drinking only water and use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses. And Christ followers have been all messed up over that verse for years, and how do we interpret this, and what do we do with this, and it's all kinds of messy. Here's what we know culturally, is that there were no wastewater treatment plants, and there was no bottled water, and that it was very, very conventional for people to mix 2 parts water with 1 part wine in order to not get dysentery. First service, I said gonorrhea, I meant giardia, but nonetheless, neither are those things that you particularly should aspire to having anytime soon. There are places to get gonorrhea, but it's probably not from the water. It was a lighthearted moment in the midst of a service where we had a power outage and any number of other random variables. Here's what we know, is that the ascetics, those Platonic thinkers, they were anti things like wine because it was a physical pleasure, which was a distraction from the things that really matter. I read some background commentaries this week where they argue pretty convincingly that what's going on in this verse is that Timothy has been profoundly influenced by these people who are saying to him, listen, how dare you give your body the pleasure of water that doesn't, mess you up really bad? You should just go in spite of your body. And Paul is making a statement not just about Timothy's physical health, but he's making a statement about the body. And what he's saying is they're wrong. Jesus wasn't an ascetic. Jesus cares about the body. What if what we eat drives our ability to love God and love people? There's a story, one more place in the Bible, in John 4, and it's this famous story that because of that I think we miss something here. John 4 is this famous story where Jesus gives this woman at the well, this profound level of dignity, a woman that normally wouldn't have been given dignity in her culture. And at the start of the interaction, it says this: now he had to go to Samaria, he being Jesus, so he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Here's where I want us to drill down. Joseph's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. What does that tell us about the incarnation? That Jesus was human and divine, that he was physically tired. Isn't it somewhat refreshing to know that Jesus' body got in his way sometimes too? That Jesus also understood that the body is something to be managed. In fact, if you keep reading, what's kind of awesome is it's like he's with a group of guys and they're all tired, and he's like, I'm really tired. You guys go into town and get me a sandwich. I'm sitting right here till you get back. What if God embraces that? There's a thinker that I bumped into in a podcast this week that I thought this was really helpful. Go ahead and make to that next one. Sorry, my order's all messed up. He says this: if we take the teaching of the incarnation seriously, then God certainly didn't find the body neutral, but quite good. So where does all this land? Listen, part of my assumption this morning is that for many of you, you came into the new year with some physical goals and probably some spiritual goals. And I wonder if sometimes God goes, let's not create a dichotomy. In fact, maybe you're to that place. I recently heard that the second stage of life happens when you realize that whatever worked in the first stage doesn't work anymore. Richard Rohr says that the second season of life is driven by the profound angst that comes from the realization that the things that you did to control life in the first phase won't work for you anymore. And I guess part of what I'm trying to get you thinking about is, what if, rather than just doubling down and more of the same things, what if you give God permission to go, man, I think I can make your marriage better if you'll commit to going for a walk a few times a week. I think I can make you more patient with your kids if you just lay off the Oreos a little bit. And I'm not trying to pick on anybody. This is such a scary topic to talk about because we all come at it from different angles. But what if you were to pay attention to what was one of the physical goals you had coming into this year? And what if you made that a literal act of devotion and worship? Listen, for some of you, it's the gym, and I totally respect those of you who it's the gym. I'm one of those guys, I'm like, it doesn't do it for me. I can't do the gym thing. Maybe it's permission to go for a walk. We do happen to live in the city with some of the most profound trails in the country. What happens if you lean into that? And that's not to say that some of those traditional disciplines aren't useful. In fact, I want to talk about chair time stuff in a couple weeks, and how do you read the Bible if you've never done it, and how do you keep reading it if you're bored with it by now? But what if we start with this realization of, wait a minute, maybe part of the disconnect in my relationships is that I'm moving so fast, and it's not just that therefore I don't make it to church or I don't read my Bible. Maybe the fact that it keeps you from getting to the gym or eating well or getting good sleep is actually tied to your experience of God and relationships. I'd like to pray. God, Lord, there's so much loaded within this conversation, and I pray that your voice and wisdom and truth would supersede my own imperfection. Lord, I pray that, God, I just think it would be awesome, God, if part of the way we put you on display in our community was that we cut down some of those dichotomous conversations where you go to churches to have your spiritual needs met and to doctors to have your physical needs met, and we understand that many of those things are interconnected. That Jesus, that we would have the kinds of experiences with you that people have when they go for a walk or a hike, that we'd have the kind of conversations in marriage that people have when they do something active together. Jesus, that you'd shed some light on some of the low-hanging fruit in our lives with regard to our nutrition and our sleep patterns. We love you, Lord.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.